All right, we're going to get started. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. My name is Shamila Chaudhry, and I am a fellow here at the Foreign Policy Institute. I run the Big Picture Initiative, and it's a forum that we started last year that explores international affairs and policy issues through arts and culture, and also kind of expanding kind of our awareness into domestic policy areas as well, which are becoming more and more relevant to foreign policy and international relations. And I think this issue in particular is something that falls within that mission quite strongly. And so that's why I'm glad that we have this opportunity to host Laura Peña, who Professor Nargis Bajogli, I said that right? Okay, good. Who kindly introduced us to, and we're happy to host this kind of under that umbrella of that project and that vision. And so today we're going to have a conversation about the zero tolerance policy and all of the issues associated with it. It's something that we all read about in the news, and we get a certain perspective from that, but today we're going to hear from somebody who actually has to work on it and make things happen. And so I think that's a very critical practitioner perspective that is valuable for all of us who care about this issue. She was previously appointed as a foreign policy advisor at the U.S. State Department under the Obama administration, and she also served as an immigration trial attorney at the U.S. Department of Homeland Security. So that makes her perspective and experience all the more kind of intriguing. I can't wait to hear the comparison between those experiences, that experience and what you're doing now. And she also worked in private practice, managing corporate business immigration strategies for technology companies in Silicon Valley. And as a native of the Rio Grande Valley, Laura joined the organization to help those most vulnerable migrant families and asylum seekers from being targeted by extreme law enforcement policies. And she's an alumna of Georgetown Law's evening program and Wellesley College. So thank you, Laura, for coming. And I'd like to very quickly also introduce Nargis. She is an award-winning anthropologist, filmmaker, and writer, and has just joined the school this past year as a professor. Her academic research focuses on the intersections of media, power, and military in Iran, and she has a book being published in 2019 on the revolution in Iran. So congratulations to that. And she's the director of a documentary film about survivors of chemical warfare in Iran, The Skin That Burns, which we should show at the school at some point. We have to talk about that. So welcome to Nargis and all of you. And so what we'll do is we'll just have Laura go through her talk and share her views, and then we'll open it up for Q&A. And I'll turn to Nargis after Laura's done just to give a few comments and questions as well, but we'll try to give all of you as much time to ask questions, and we'll end promptly at 6.
That's wonderful.
Okay.
Thank you, Shamila.
Yeah, no
Thank
problem.
you to SAIS and Nargis and to the Big Picture Institute. I'm so happy to have you all here. I know it's late in the day, and you're taking time. Maybe some of you got out of class, or maybe left work early, or made time while you were on vacation. My friend here. When Shamila and I first spoke about the objective of the Big Picture Institute, I wanted to make sure that I was thinking about the work I do, not in necessarily a technical sense, but really in a sort of practical, real life sense. How has my life been impacted by what's happening right now on the border? And so it's with that I'm going to ask everyone to close their eyes. So if you could close your eyes and just take one deep breath. Take another deep breath. This is also what happens when you leave DC and live in California for 5 years. But as your eyes are closed, I want you to do something else. I'd like you to put your hands on your lap. I'd like you to place the insides of your wrists together so they are touching. And I want you to imagine the cold feel of metal handcuffs surrounding your wrists. A long chain links to a heavy, thick chain of metal tightly wrapped around your mid-waist. Your feet sit just inches apart, tightly shackled. And as you sit in a 5-point restraint near 100 other strangers, I want you to think of a child in your life. It could be your own child. a cousin, a niece or nephew, sibling, maybe even a grandchild. Maybe a child you have even babysat. I want you to picture this child in your mind, the color of his or her eyes. I want you to smell the child's hair. I want you to hear the child calling your name or laughing. Now imagine that you are at the end of a weeks-long journey with this child, having fled the only home you know. And you have no idea where this child is. You are sitting in a cold courtroom filled with other adults, but here there are no children, and the child you have protected along this arduous journey is gone. As you wait for a judge to enter the room to preside over the prosecution of your illegal entry into this foreign country, you hear a voice call for your attention, and you open your eyes. Atención, por favor. My name is Laura Peña. I am an attorney with the Texas Civil Rights Project. I am here because I help defend the human rights of all individuals in Texas. If you have been separated from your child or a young family member, please come forward. I'm here to help you find your child. Between May 24th and June 20th, the Texas Civil Rights Project interviewed 381 parents at the federal courthouse in McAllen, Texas, who had been separated from their children. Very similar circumstance that we just tried to imagine in our minds. And it's this precise moment where we reassert our humanity as a nation. When I look into a father's eyes and I tell him for the first time that I'm here to help him, and I ask him, what is the name of his child? What is the date of birth of his child? Does his child have any health conditions that we need to be made aware of? Does he have a point of contact in the United States who can help us coordinate the reunification? And tell this father for the first time that a grave injustice has been done to him. And that injustice, that the taking of his child, is against our own laws and against international laws. And that he is not alone. In thinking about how we got to the situation where we're at today with the family separation, it's important to put the crisis into some historical context. We all know that it's not the first time the United States government has targeted families in America simply based on their national origin and imprisoned them in tent cities. But given today's crisis at our borders, it's especially important to look at our historical relationship with Central America. Sorry, I'm seeing familiar faces. As I think through my own life, I was actually recalling my late uncle, Federal Judge Filemon Vivela. He was actually one of the first Hispanic Latino appointed federal judges in the nation. He was actually excommunicated from his local Catholic church for presiding over the prosecution of a woman by the name of Stacy Merkt. Stacy Merkt was a layperson who worked for Casa Oscar Romero, run by the Catholic diocese, and who Pope Francis just canonized as a saint. Ms. Merkt assisted hundreds of Salvadorans fleeing their home country from persecution by their own government, and she was charged, prosecuted for harboring and transporting illegal aliens under federal law. And in rendering her sentence, my uncle said, and this is a quote, "I know you are a person of high principle, but breaking the law is not the way to go." In response, Ms. Merck said, "We've already seen more than 40,000 deaths in El Salvador, mostly all civilians killed by government forces. The Reagan administration continues to support that government, the government that has created the refugees. And despite evidence of the horrors and growing sanctuary movement supported by churches and human rights advocacy groups, the State Department continued to toe a hard line, saying that the Salvadorans were quote-unquote economic migrants and therefore not eligible for asylum." It sounds terribly familiar in today's climate. Yeah, I was 2 years old when that conviction came down in 1984, and I always try and put myself in the other person's shoes. So I think if I had been 2 years old at the time, if I had been born in El Salvador, fled the violence as a child refugee, I've been to that place in San Benito, Texas, that Casa Oscar Romero, and if I had sat underneath that mesquite tree, maybe hoping the nuns would have extra tortillas for the kids, and maybe my family would have moved to Los Angeles, like many of the other families. And maybe the school would not have been prepared for me, and I would have felt ostracized. Maybe I would have trauma that was never reconciled. Maybe, just maybe, I would have found another type of refuge and home with a different type of family, like MS-13. Because it's people about my age, some younger, some older, who the United States government has deported back to Central America as hardened gang members. Between 2010 and 2015, the U.S. and Mexican government combined deported nearly 1 million Salvadorans, Guatemalans, and Hondurans. And this led advocacy groups to call President Obama the deporter-in-chief. During his first term, it was one of the highest deportations in recent history. And it was also during President Obama's first term that I served at the State Department, traveling frequently to Central America. And I remember the exact moment when I fully understood that there was a serious problem in Central America that we had to wrap our hands around. And I was in Costa Rica, which is the beacon of democracy and peace in Central America. And we were meeting with civil society representatives, and they were telling us, it's really difficult. We have to pagar la renta, which means pay the rent to the local gang members in order to live in their neighborhoods. They were creating fake cell phones to put on their belongings, and they would hide their real cell phones because you'd go out and you'd be popped just if you didn't have a cell phone to steal. And so we would go back to Washington, we would come back to Washington, and we'd elevate the issue, right? Huge problem. The gangs are networked. They've determined their territories. They've moved not only from drug trafficking, gun trafficking, now it's human smuggling and human trafficking. We have to assist with the reintegration of the deportees into these countries, otherwise they're going to set root in these already fragile institutions, and it's going to become a national security threat. The response? Well, it's a tough sell. American taxpayers don't want their money spent on Spanish language classes for MS-13 members, for job trainings for gang members who are wreaking havoc on the streets of LA. Yeah, so it sort of fell on deaf ears. We did what we could, but really not enough. Fast forward a couple of years, and it's 2014, and it's my first few weeks on the job as a trial attorney with Immigration and Customs Enforcement, ICE. I was at the immigration court in downtown Los Angeles, which honestly is as diverse as any United Nations gathering. I had decided that the 50,000-foot policy level work was just increasingly frustrating for me. And I wanted to get close to the problem, at least see like one sliver of the problem really up close and personal. Plus, it was California, it's tough to get a job. I needed a job, I'll be honest. And it was a good job. It was good to learn the immigration system from the inside, particularly at that moment, because shortly after I started is when the border surge happened. When mothers and children primarily started leaving Central America in droves and presenting themselves at our border to seek asylum. It was a true humanitarian crisis inflicted as a result of the civil violence and unrest in the region, much of it at the hands of gang members that the United States had deported. The gangs who had taken hold of the young and fragile institutions that were still recovering from mass atrocities led by dictators and military leaders only decades earlier, also policies which the United States has supported. I'll never forget one hearing during the border surge crisis. The judge called up the case, and the respondent, which is what you call the individual in these proceedings, the respondent appears, and the respondent is a 6-month-old baby. And the judge yells at me, "Counsel, how am I supposed to get a 6-month-old on the record?" These courtrooms are tiny, smaller than this room, and packed with people. And I just felt the entire room stare at the back of my head and sort of sigh in agreement. I wanted to melt into my chair, so I said sheepishly, "Judge, the government moves to reset. This case was administratively separated from the mother's case. Of course you can't put a 6-month-old on the record." And yet here we are 4 years later, and it's not only administrative separation, but physical separation of families as a matter of de facto policy to deter migrants from seeking refuge from violence. Violence in their home countries, largely created, once again, due to U.S. policies in the region. Mass deportations of gang members from the U.S. without any sustainable plan for reintegration of those individuals. I'm going to attempt to put a basic framework around the Trump administration's approach to implementing family separation as part of their anti-immigrant platform. And there are 3 stages. The first one was overt family separation. The second is covert family separations. And now the third, which hasn't quite yet happened, but there are proposals, is what I call false choice separation. So overt family separation and detention strategy began quietly. We know now, and there are reports that the government began piloting family separations in July of 2017 in Texas and New Mexico. And on April 6th, the Attorney General Jeff Sessions issued the zero tolerance directive requiring all U.S. attorneys to prosecute every single illegal entry crime, which has not been done before. At the same time, DHS stripped Obama-era policies prioritizing the protection of parental rights for non-citizens. We would also hear leaders from the administration, such as John Kelly, Stephen Miller, and the Attorney General himself, touting separation as a deterrent to asylum-seeking migrants, particularly those from non-English-speaking Spanish countries. Others, such as Secretary Nielsen, denied a policy existed, while in the same breath would defend the use of all means necessary to enforce the immigration laws. So what did it really look like? The overt family separation look like in practice? I want you to imagine a bridge. And it's just a bridge. It's, 2 cars can go on one side, 2 cars can go on the other side. It's a bridge. And I want you to imagine a family, an asylum-seeking family, trying to walk across the bridge. All right, this family gets halfway through to the bridge, and a Border Patrol agent asks them for their papers. And they say, "We don't have any papers, but we're scared to go back. We're trying to see if we can seek protection in your country." And the Border Patrol agent says, "We don't have space for you. No tenemos espacio. No hay capacidad." No space, no capacity. In 2016, DHS adopted what they called a metering policy, which is a practice used to regulate the flow of asylum seekers at ports of entry. Bridges, all right? Just tell them no, they have to wait. This practice violates not only our own refugees, but a bedrock principle of refugee law called refoulement. It's widely established in international law that you cannot turn asylum seekers away and send them back to a country that will cause them greater harm. The State Department has issued a warning for the state of Tamaulipas, which is on the other side of the border in South Texas, that the crime and insecurity is so bad that Americans are warned not to go there. It's dangerous on the other side of that bridge. And that family keeps going back. They're going to go back the next day and again. And they're going to be turned away until, what are they going to do? They're going to cross the river. So this family, afraid for their safety, is now being pushed to enter the United States illegally. So they cross the bridge. Many will actually look for Border Patrol. They actually try and present themselves to whatever agent is there monitoring the illegal crossing. So Border Patrol will apprehend the family and take them to a facility which is locally called La Perera, the dog pound. And you've seen the photos. That's where they're the chain link fences. That's where families and children are caged. Children caged like animals. Depending on the age of the children, parents and kids may be put in different cages. And there are some visiting privileges among the cages. The parent can say, I want to go see my 10-year-old daughter, and they'll allow a brief encounter in one of those cages. One cage was designated for parents with tender-aged children. That's what they were calling them first. And I read another report calling them nonverbal children. These are babies. Language matters. Under overt family separation, the parents were told a variety of different reasons why their child was being taken away from them. In one case, one of our cases, the agent admonished a mother for committing the crime of illegal entry and told her that because she illegally crossed, they were taking the child away from her as punishment. In other cases, Nazi-era type of crazy shit, somebody was told that their daughter was being taken for a bath, only to not see her child again for 3 months. Many parents were told that they would see their children again, right before they go to their criminal prosecution hearing. And as we conducted the interviews at the courthouse, it became clear to us that they were not going to see their children again. So we would have to tell the parents, your child may not be there when you get back. You've never heard a mother's wail like that before. When a mother realizes where it sets in that after everything she's gone through, she may not see her child again. Recently, the DHS Office of Inspector General released a report finding that specifically in McAllen, Texas, which is where I'm working with the organization, Border Patrol, instead of returning adult parents from their federal prosecution hearing back to the same dog pound facility, instead they would transfer them directly to ICE in order to, quote, avoid doing additional paperwork. This could have prevented at least some family separations. All to avoid doing additional paperwork. At that point, the child is classified as an unaccompanied minor, and the parent is placed into what's called expedited removal proceedings. These types of proceedings have very, very few legal protections. Many parents were deported without their children. On the ground, the Texas Civil Rights Project had been invited by the federal public defenders to interview the parents about the family separations. So once we had those conversations, we wrote down the information. We would compile the data, the information, and we'd share it with a local nonprofit who provides legal services to the children. All right, so we're talking to the parents, so we turn to other partners who are meeting the kids, right? So this nonprofit organization was seeing children, toddlers who were not prepared for these journeys. They were not unaccompanied. Kids who were saying, "Where is my mom?" Already freaked out, traumatized from leaving their home, and then exhibiting signs of compound trauma. Not only did they flee their home, but now this perceived abandonment by their parents. So this organization used the information that we gathered to track down the parents in the immigration system. And so we would coordinate on a nightly basis, and in the first weeks of the overt family separation crisis, we were matching families at a faster rate than the government, to the point that ICE went to the local nonprofit and asked them for their lists of the families. We later learned that the sophisticated database that the government had been touting in keeping track of all these families was actually just an Excel spreadsheet. Effing Excel, right? It's really important to pause here to emphasize the magnitude of the information being collected from the parents. What we visualized at the beginning of that talk, because this is really what human rights advocacy looks like on the ground. We're talking to those most vulnerable people whose rights are being violated by the state. Gathering information, parents' name, date of birth, country of origin, child's name, child's date of birth, country of origin, and assigning value to points of data that separate have no meaning, but that together becomes valuable information. That becomes a family. That information breathes life into laws and policies such as the best interest of a child, such as the parental rights of non-citizens, and the constitutional liberty interest in family unity, which applies to all people in the United States regardless of their status. As most of you know, there was an international outcry over the family separations, which moved the president in a rare about-face, signing an executive order on June 20th, and shortly thereafter, a federal judge in San Diego issued an injunction stopping the practice of family separations and ordering the government to reunify those who had been separated. But this is when stage 2 began. The covert family separation and detention policy. The executive order requires keeping families together during the pendency of their criminal or immigration proceedings. And officials have been very clear that prosecutions of all irregular entries is the goal. So the tent city in Tornillo, Texas didn't just pop up overnight. It's part of a plan to continue prosecution of asylum seekers and detain families longer for eventual deportation. The zero tolerance prosecutions and family separations, by the way, they're still happening. Every day my organization still shows up at the McAllen Federal Courthouse twice a day, and we ask people to come forward. Just this morning, there were 7 separations. That's only one courthouse along 2,000 miles of border. So while there are fewer parent-child separations, family separations are still happening in large numbers. So many siblings, cousins, nephews and nieces, grandparents and grandchildren are being separated by the government. Border Patrol recently provided statistics to Amnesty International in their report, and in their report, they indicated that at least 8,000 family units, including non-parental families, have been separated. 8,000. That's probably a low number. In South Texas, we're hearing reports that those local nonprofits that provide services to the children are anticipating servicing 25,000 children next year. 25,000. The government is tightening the screws of the policy to release children to family members with more vetting and stricter scrutiny. ICE has deported at least 40 undocumented sponsors who simply volunteered to take a child's family member out of government detention. People are scared. Metering at the ports of entry continues, with reports that the list of asylum seekers waiting their turn to be called at the bridge in Tijuana is at least 1,000 people on any given day. This is what covert family separation and detention looks like. Unfortunately, there was a false promise to end this practice, but really all it did was sweep it under the rug. Now, what about the ACLU litigation? According to the latest joint status report, 136 children still have not been reunified with their parents. For our clients, we have at least 12 parents still in immigration detention who have not been reunified with their children for a variety of reasons, ranging from nonviolent criminal offenses, question of parentage, and other challenges. Very briefly on the last stage, what I call false choice separations. There's a report that the government is now considering changing the strategy up to comply with the law. Instead of separating families at the dog pound, they're going to keep families together for 20 days. And 20 days is the magic number under what's called the Flores Settlement Agreement. This was a class action case that requires children to be released from immigration detention after 20 days into either with family members or into an appropriate government care facility. And so they'll keep the families together for 20 days, and then they'll make the parent choose. Do you want to stay in detention until you have your asylum case heard, which could take months, maybe even years? Or do you want your child released to the government? And maybe your aunt will get your child out of government custody, maybe not. It's a false choice. That is not the only choice. Under the second term of President Obama, they really fleshed out what they called ATD, Alternatives to Detention. And they were really successful. It basically means that, folks would check in, basically kind of like with probation officers. Call in, or sometimes they had ankle monitors, but they would show up to their immigration court hearings date. They want their day in court. The real challenge is, in this environment, people don't want them in our country. And that is a bigger problem to address. For those last cases that I mentioned, those parents that are still in detention, I'm very cognizant that these parents have arguably suffered the most severe pain, going on about 5 months for having been separated from their children. And it's in this space where, again, advocacy brings out the humanity of our system. So I'm going to tell you just one last story. One of our clients, Angela, called me in a panic. She had not been able to talk to her child for 3 weeks, even though there's a judicial order requiring regular communication between parent and child. So we got to action. We left voicemails, sent emails, try and track down. One caseworker was terminated. The ICE deportation officer is on, vacation, trying to figure it out until finally we get 2 human beings, one at the government shelter, a caseworker, and one deportation at ICE. And we get them to agree on a date and a time and a phone number. We're going to make this call happen. 1 p.m. Central, 2 p.m. Eastern. Mom's in South Texas, child's in Miami. And so at 1:30, I get a frantic call from the caseworker. Miss Peña, the mother hasn't called. I have the daughter sitting here with me. She's starting to cry. Are you going to get the mother on the line? Yes, let me see if I can call ICE, see what's going on. So I call and I'm just praying that somebody answers. Half the time they don't answer, to be honest, or it's busy. Somebody answers, and I actually get to talk to the officer who I scheduled this call with, and I say, Agent Pinnell, the mom hasn't called. Is there a holdup? He says, Miss Peña, it's at 2 o'clock. I said, Officer, we went through this. It says on the paperwork 1 p.m. Central, 2 p.m. Eastern. Oh. All right. We'll see if we can get the mom on the phone. Play. But before he hung up, I did tell him. I explained to him. Just so you know, officer, the daughter is sitting next to the phone at the shelter, waiting and wondering if her mother is going to call as you had promised her and as I had promised her. The stripping away of human dignity happens in moments with very, very small actions. A government official not caring enough to mark the right time for a mother's phone call, leaving an already distraught, exhausted daughter wondering, does my mother even care? If she cared, she'd be calling me right now, right? Hillary Clinton recently gave a speech on human rights honoring Eleanor Roosevelt and the Declaration of Human Rights. And she called us to continue translating the words of human rights into facts on the ground, into the reality of people's everyday lives, into those small spaces close to home, so close and so small that they cannot be seen on any map of the world. That is where rights become real. For many of you, your role as future policymakers, advisors, advocates, lawyers, your job as an agent for social justice, should you choose that, is to find those spaces where a vacuum has been created and breathe life and human dignity into it. Because there's no human rights violation in a missed telephonic appointment. But there is a human rights violation in torturing a child, waiting minute after minute for her mother's phone call. The Inspector General's report analyzed 12 parents' access to phone calls with their children. Of the 12 parents surveyed, only 6 had their judicially ordered phone call with their children while they were in custody. Of those 6, 4 parents had done so only with the assistance of outside counsel and advocates. Only 2 of those had been facilitated by the government. These are the small spaces that we are all challenged to fill with rights and dignity and respect. And the dizzying upheaval and in some instances the suspension of rule of law in our own country, protecting those spaces must guide our work at the national level. And I'll be honest, it really is an uphill battle. But at the end of the day, at least one little girl will sleep having heard her mother's voice, telling her that she loves her and that she's trying everything she can do to get back to her. And that as a family, that they know that they are not alone. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Why don't we go to Meredith, and I'll have a few things to say, and we'll open it up after that. Thank you, Laura. This is really interesting. So 2 sort of overarching things I want to mention, and then a question that I have. One of the things that I find so frustrating about our immigration system, which I think you're bringing out in this talk, is that it brings together our domestic policy failings together with our foreign policy failings, which oftentimes it's our foreign policy that is even creating the refugee crisis, if you will, in this case, and not so much about sending back MS-13, for example, that you mentioned, who were coming here, different, and not being able to reintegrate, but also U.S. foreign policy throughout the 1970s and 80s actively sustained and promoted wars in Central America, causing so much of the refugee crisis to begin with. And so what makes all of this so difficult is that here we're having, we're having, I think what the Trump administration is doing is blowing up for all of us to very clearly see the conflation between very hypocritical, in my opinion, foreign policy that the United States has pursued, especially in Latin America, for a very long period of time, which then causes vast
migration in the ways that it's been. It's not the only reason, but it does, I think, have a large role to play. And then also with sort of the bedrock of, in his mind and in his policy, in his administration's mind, a certain vision of what America has always been and needs to stay to be. So for me, what's really interesting about what's going on is, and interesting is not the point, but at around the same time that you had the issue with the border beginning to happen, which, as you stated, was happening long before it came into the national news under the Trump administration. You also have the Muslim ban. You also had DACA being taken away. And you also have voter suppression actively happening against Black communities all across the country. And so what's happening is this multi-pronged attack on communities across this country who are non-white. And it's happening in such a chaotic manner, I think on purpose in many ways, because then it doesn't allow us to pull back and connect the dots and understand that these dots are all related. So if our community is personally affected, we're super concentrated on that one issue to make sure that there's, we're trying to lessen the harm as much as possible. And it's very difficult then to make connections with all the other communities that are also being hurt in this way. And so one of my questions is there any time at all in the type of work that you all have been doing to be connecting with groups that are also facing similar pressure from the Trump administration that are not at the border, that are facing pressures in other areas of the country? And if not, part of that is probably because we're constantly in crisis mode, but how can we pull back maybe at certain points from crisis mode and try to connect those dots and sort of see this as a larger policy of white supremacy? And then another question is, you talked about national empathy and how part of the problem is that as a nation, the rhetoric is such that it makes it that we don't want these people in this country, right? And so how do we keep, it's really difficult to talk about how do we create empathy, but how do we keep especially the awareness in phase 2 and 3 that you brought out? Because phase 1, since it was it became so visual after a while that it was easy in a way to have it, once enough pressure was applied, to have it come onto the national stage and be sustained in media. But when phase 2 and phase 3 are much more covert, they're not easily pictorialized, they're not easy to make viral on a video, how do we then bring that into the conversation and say, hey, we can't forget about what's happening on the border, in addition to all these other things that are happening around the country? So those are sort of the two main things.
So hold that thought. I'm going to add onto that.
And did you write down your questions?
Yes, I did.
All right.
But you're clearly a superwoman, so you don't need any reminding, right? I think everyone agrees. She's doing tremendous work. So just to pick up on a few things that Nargis said, which I completely agree with you. I think that this is a set of policies that is coordinated but meant to be chaotic, and usually in any kind of policy implementation, you can't control the chaos. Once it starts to get implemented to a certain extent, you can. There's always a chain of command and a process, but at some point you have to wait and see what happens. But in this case, that's under normal kind of policy process and implementation. In this case, there clearly seems to be an architect of or architects of this policy and approach. And the implementers on the ground are also very much invested in maintaining the kind of original vision of that policy, right? Usually there's a gap between Washington and then how it's implemented in the field, whether it's in the states or, right, to some extent, right? And so to me, this is really intriguing as a policy issue because there doesn't seem to be that kind of gap. So, but perhaps there is on the ground. And so what I'd like to hear from you is, kind of to what extent is there any difference between what's being said in Washington and coming out of the administration and then what's actually happening on the ground? Do you have a different sense of that from the bureaucrats that you're working with? So that's one thing. And then would love your thoughts on whether you think this kind of policy approach, this very aggressive approach, is it's a hardline approach towards an immigration policy that was broken to begin with, and that, there were so many unresolved questions that, from previous administrations that we hadn't dealt with, that it came to this. And is this kind of like a political ploy by the administration to force everyone to come and hash out something more reasonable? I don't believe that, but at some point the rhetoric shifted and it was focused on, the administration was saying, well, Democrats forced us to do this, right? And I don't mean to bring up partisanship, but I do think that that's part of this kind of understanding what this policy is about. And then finally, what do you see as the foreign policy implications of this? So those are just some broad themes. And so let's go to what Nargis was talking about, which is relationship with other groups, and then the role of empathy, and then we'll go from there.
All right, I'll do my best. To the question on everybody's under attack, how can we work together? I think at least a silver lining of the madness at the beginning of stage one was that groups who had not necessarily traditionally looked at immigration as an issue, particularly philanthropic investors, looked to organizations like ours, and they saw us on the ground defending human rights and bringing the conversation. And you notice I was very focused on human rights in my conversation, and so bringing all of it under an umbrella, at least from where I sit, human rights makes sense. And that's how we're bridging with organizations that we traditionally have not historically worked with. Additionally, other organizations are feeling the pinch and are expanding themselves. LGBTQ organizations have not traditionally worked in the space, A, with Latino communities, at least for the border, and then B, with migrant communities. But there now are increasingly more programs to help particularly LGBTQ asylum seekers and individuals who are in removal proceedings. So there are some silver linings. You mentioned voting rights too. So the Texas Civil Rights Project, we have 3 pillars. We don't only work on racial and economic justice, which is part of the immigrant rights work that I do, but we also work in the space of voting rights. And so Texas is now hot thanks to Beto's campaign. But there's at least 1.8 million newly registered voters in Texas, and Texas actually has a 30-year-old law that requires high schools to register high school seniors twice a year. And a majority of those high schools are not in compliance with the state law. So looking at really tangible laws that are on the books, and trying to marry that with advocacy and other groups who have not necessarily traditionally worked in the voter registration space. So those are some of those, because everybody's under attack, finding those overlaps that have been helpful. Second was on empathy.
Well, and like,
Oh,
because
yeah,
these last
yeah,
two
yeah,
phases
no,
are so covered.
Yeah. So I think a turning point in the first phase, and I remember because I was on a news show for like one of the first times, and I was so nervous, and I hadn't heard, but there was an audio that had been leaked of a baby crying, right? Mama, mama. You just hear the pained baby and the mother. And that was the first time I heard it. It was on live TV, and I started crying. Keep it together. But when you hear that audio, that baby's skin does not have any color. It's just a baby, just like anybody else's. And so finding that same, I don't know how you do it. I don't know how you make that human connection, that empathy. But you have to, we all bleed the same. That sort of really values, I hate saying values-based, but really humanities, that's where we're at, because the value stuff, it seems to be just, it's not resonating. So it has to be from like here, something that gets you like right there. And in the next 2 phases, it's going to be difficult. And I think 2 things. One, the role of journalists and reporters is so critical, and they cannot stop. 2, I also think the role of artists and media, I'm saying like non-traditional media, is really important. I got on the phone with Nani de la Peña, who is like on her Wikipedia page, she's called the godmother of virtual reality. And so we're talking about how can we use VR to help keep this in the national spotlight, particularly when it's ever increasingly militarized and there's not a whole lot of access to it. So that's going to be a challenge, but we really can't give up. And then your first one, I don't talk to bureaucrats, so I don't know.
What's your take on kind of how this policy was conceived of in Washington amongst who? Post-Obama, right?
I mean, Stephen Miller apparently is the brainchild of it, from what I read. But having been the immigration system, my takeaway, having been on the law enforcement side of the immigration system, is that there are no checks and balances. And it's such a sort of a life and death system for many people. To have it all sit under the executive branch, pretty much all. I mean, you can appeal into, but only in certain. You can get into federal court. Obviously, Supreme Court has weighed in on issues of immigration law, but the core of the system is under the White House, and so it changes. And there's not a whole lot, and there's a lot of bureaucracy, blah blah blah, and it's difficult to engage in interagency policy decision making. But for immigration law, it's pretty. There's not a whole lot of space between Washington and the ground. There really isn't. You know what your president has said. You know what your secretary of your agency has said and has implemented or issued implementing policy guidance, and then you go do the job. And so it's whatever you hear, whatever you're thinking about, that's what you're implementing. And sure, there'll be some variance between one person and another, but for the most part, it's pretty efficient, oddly. And so when you have, it's not like this. No, it's not.
You have said that we're being recorded, but anyway.
Yeah, no, it's not. It is. The directive to separate families was tested. It was tried. They were doing it already. They knew what they were going to be doing, and the agents on the ground who were conducting the separations were callous about it. And so that's when you get into a situation where you have a system that is on steroids and has too much power. When a system has too much power, then there's abuse of power, and then you're getting, to sort of like critical, like quintessential human sort of stuff, right? People will abuse power if they can. And in places where you have a majority of Latinos, like the border, most of the Border Patrol agents are Latino. Many of them come from immigrant families. So you have this sort of weird, sort of messed up dynamic where citizens and community members are distinguishing themselves from the migrants who are trying to seek refuge in their home area. So it's
So let's open it up. We'll take a few questions at a time. Comments, thoughts? Don't be shy.
So I would like to know a little bit more about how you're funded. Can you say more about who's chosen to support your work?
I don't know if I know the answer to that. I'm a visiting attorney. It's mainly institutional. It's grassroots and institutional donors.
So there are foundations that support your work?
Yes.
I say this as
I know
someone
Ford
who's
and
Open Society.
Open Society we want more from, but I know they give us a little bit of money. Yes, I'm happy to have you talk to the person who actually knows. We did get a good amount of grassroots donations as a result of the work that we were doing on the family separation issue.
Would you permit another question?
Yes, of course.
So I'm thinking about what you said right at the beginning about that this is, of course, not the first time that people have, from an institutional and governmental point of view, faced this. And I often wonder, just from a moral point of view, whether other people many years ago sat in a room and learned about it or read about it or talked about it with friends over coffee? Is there more knowledge available to us now? Is there a hope that with knowledge we will act? Did people know? And I don't quite have the question articulated, but I guess I'm wondering about the morality of knowledge. And for those who have a longer view on other moments that we in America knew, and maybe we didn't know, maybe we did know. There's no shortage of information about this and visibility fueled by social media, fueled by journalists.
Right.
Did people, to what degree did people know? To what degree do we know? How do you see the moral imperative around knowing at this moment?
I think one of the reasons why there was such an uproar is because it struck a chord in our moral consciousness as a nation. And why the reaction was so visceral is because we've seen it before. Maybe not, our own eyes, but we've read it and we know it. And so there's at least that, that there's a knee-jerk reaction when we start imprisoning people based on where they're from. Right now, the moral imperative is huge because they're scaling up now. And I don't have an answer to that. How do we go about bringing that out of people? Because it is common knowledge, We had a volunteer come from Northern California. She's of Japanese descent, and she came because her parents, and she was older, her parents were in internment. And so that could be, again, role of media, journalists. It is definitely something that should be looked at.
I have a question just about the mechanics of this, the metering and some of the other practices that are going on at the border.
Sure.
Do you get the sense that that is determined sort of on an ad hoc local basis,
No.
or it's organized from DHS?
Yes, it's all of these policies come straight from Washington. And if you want to look, the Office of Inspector General issued a report recently on it. Amnesty International also released a report recently on it. And in South Texas, another local organization just filed a request for precautionary measures with the International Commission on Human Rights. And they have specific clients who were turned away at the ports of entry, so they're trying to attack it on the international front. It's basically, they're saying that they don't have capacity, which is the numbers of crossings have not skyrocketed or anything. They've pretty been consistent. And so what they do is some days they'll let 5 people in, some days 20, some days nobody. And at certain ports of entry, they will designate one particular migrant or asylum seeker to have a notebook of all the names of people and organize them. And so you sign your name, that's the order that you will be called. So when Border Patrol says we'll take 5 today, a migrant who's been selected among the migrants will go to the notebook and cross them out. You asked about mechanics, so this is how it's happening.
Mm-hmm.
And so they'll cross off the notebook, and soon as the organizer who's been helping keep track of the list is called, then she finds another organizer and passes off the notebook. What's also happening is because there was a lot of media attention on the migrants who were sitting in the middle of the bridge under heat, no food. I don't know if anybody saw that. It was maybe 6-7 months ago. So now instead of turning them away right in the middle of the bridge, we're coordinating with the Mexican federal government. And it's the federales on the Mexican side that before they even get to the middle of the bridge, you have to have a Mexican visa, basically, some sort of Mexican official documentation in order to pass. And so they're now pushing people back further into those Mexican border towns. And that's sometimes where the lists are being topped.
So you were saying that the numbers have stayed pretty consistent. But recently with the caravan coming from Honduras,
Honduras, yeah.
how do you think that that's going to be handled because they're coming towards the U.S. and
Yeah.
Mike Pence said in a conference on prosperity, I think it was last weekend, that if they can't come to the country legally, then they shouldn't come at all, and that the country should be telling everybody to go back, go back. How do you think that that's going to be handled?
You know, the Mexicans have really beefed up the border, their southernmost border. So a lot of people will be stopped in Mexico. They're not stopped in Mexico. I mean, you see the tent cities being built. And so expedited removal proceedings are very sort of limited legal protections. So depending on the reason why they're fleeing Honduras, particularly with the Attorney General, he's sort of reducing availability of asylum based on claims of gang violence or domestic violence. So they're not going to have a whole lot of options. And what's going to happen to them is what's happening to most people is they're going to be deported if they make it through.
I have a question. I'm kind of confused. You said in 2014 you were a trial attorney and you were working with trial.
ICE.
So you were representing the government in the courtrooms.
Yes, I deported people for 2 years.
So what changes, like, why does your perspective change from going to being the ones to reuniting those?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I joined ICE to learn, first of all, the government, particularly in the immigration system, the government has all the power. All the power. Hugely imbalanced dynamic. And I knew that under President Obama, that executive actions were coming out that were going to grant ICE attorneys the ability to really decide what they could do with their own cases. It was called prosecutorial discretion. And so because President Obama had prioritized the types of immigrants who should be deported, prioritized being criminals, gang members, which I was internally conflicted about, etc. For all those others who did not fall into a prioritized, I had the authority to close those cases, meaning as the government attorney, I would say, okay, the government is not going to pursue removal over you. And I did that a lot. And in the place, particularly in the government space like ICE, there's not a whole lot of lawyers like me who have the same understanding of the history, of the culture, etc. And so I decided to join ICE after consulting with a lot of lawyers, immigration lawyers, about whether it would be a good idea for me to be on the government end. And they said, yes, you can do a lot of good. And I did do a lot of good. Why did I switch? I left ICE in 2016 before the presidential election. I was hoping that Hillary Clinton would be elected, to be honest, and that I would then use that experience at ICE to do policy work, to change some of the policies that I saw that were not working on the ground. In the small chance that Donald Trump would be elected, I didn't want to be anywhere close to ICE because I knew this would happen. So that's why I left. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, I have one more question. So
Okay.
for you, what is the definition of a criminal?
So, criminal history. If you have been convicted of a crime, then you have a criminal history. So that could be a misdemeanor. So the prosecutions happening right now of asylum seekers, they're leaving with misdemeanor criminal convictions. So that would be a criminal conviction as opposed to a civil conviction. I'm not convincing you. She's a tough one. All right, give it to me.
She's going to be a lawyer,
I know. Yeah, I mean, but it's a good question because, you know, in the national media you say, oh, you're just going to send back the criminals, or they're all criminals, right?
Exactly.
I mean, and it's a gray area. It's a gray area, absolutely. I have a father right now who's not being reunited with his 15-year-old daughter. He has 2 DUI convictions, a burglary tools conviction, and a possession of methamphetamine. The government sure as heck thinks he's a criminal and that he's not eligible for withholding of removal. I am arguing that he is, that those convictions are not particularly serious crimes, which would be a bar to the relief that he's trying to seek. So it gets super nuanced, and being in a space where you can think through them, that information, but really critically, is so important. And that's what advocacy looks like.
I think this is where that question of values also comes in, right? And then the values as espoused by the government, essentially, directly or indirectly.
Yeah,
right?
absolutely.
Yeah.
I just wanted to add, I think the question was more, actually, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but for me, what that question sort of made me think about is this idea of what does status mean anyway, right? I mean, I mean, if you're a criminal, it means you've committed a crime, but what does that say about your value and your worth as a human being, as a person? Certainly someone who has crossed the border, not at a port of entry, has committed a crime.
Right.
Are they a criminal?
Are they a criminal?
The government thinks they're, but what does that mean about their overall worth? And I think that question sort of, to me, brings up the whole, concept of, well, what does it mean to have status, or what does it mean to not have status, right? You ascribe normative positions to what's essentially a legal construction.
Yeah.
Right?
Really
And then everyone buys in, right? You're breaking the law. You don't deserve to be. Well, I mean, people run red lights, right? That's, a crime, right? I mean, you ascribe a certain value to someone who runs a red light versus someone who crosses a border, and that's not necessarily the same as somebody who commits murder, right? Or who does some other crime. And I think just when we are looking at these issues, for me, it's important to understand that there are statuses and infractions that come from violation of rules and laws that don't themselves have normative value outside what we think or what society gets pushed onto.
Which is why also, sorry to jump in, the framework of viewing this through human rights is so problematic. Because human rights then assumes that those statuses are things that should be valued. And so when we do view this work, or many other types of work, through the framework of human rights, it actually is prioritizing a certain sort of state view on
No, but human rights are inherent. It's not that the state determines what human rights are. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights actually declares that they're essential to who we are as human beings. So I would actually argue that human rights supports this argument, that it's not about crimes or status. It's about the right to be able to live and have a job and all of these great things that are core to who we are as humans.
Right, but then how do those indications, who's making those indicators? Who is, it's sort of asking the deeper question of how are these statuses being defined, who's evaluating that, and that's coming from positions of power that then determine. So, so then is the framework the right framework to be looking at? And that's a much deeper conversation that's not going to get resolved.
And if the administration doesn't value human rights, the international human rights agenda, then it doesn't really matter, right?
Exactly.
There's no accountability in that regard to a certain extent.
Yeah, because that's where the power of it is supposed to.
It's always been a tough part of human rights, is accountability.
No, definitely. We have a couple questions back here. So first, here, and then.
We're starting to see the makeup of the federal judiciary change very rapidly with this current Senate and current administration. How does this sort of change the sort of legal action game, just going forward?
Do you want to take that one, Bert?
No, I don't.
This is my buddy Bert. He works for the Mexican American Legal Defense and Education Fund. He's a civil rights lawyer.
I was texting
You were
with my
texting?
brother who wants to know if I want to go visit my goddaughter. So.
Oh, okay. All right, so I'll take it. The judiciary. I mean, the judiciary. In this space, I mean, it's recently the Supreme Court came down with a decision. It's the Jennings decision, and it has greatly reduced the ability for asylum seekers to seek release from immigration detention, right? And so as a result of that Supreme Court decision, the Attorney General there's an authority for the Attorney General to pluck decisions from the Board of Immigration Appeals. And so he's taken out a decision and he basically assigns it to himself for review. And so it hurts the brain. So he's assigned it to himself for review given the Supreme Court decision in Jennings. And basically what's going to happen is right now, if you cross the border and you say, I'm afraid to go home or back to my home country, you have the right to speak before an asylum officer. Right now, if you talk to the asylum officer says, okay, I think you have a credible fear of persecution in your home country, then that person is eligible for bond. Sometimes these bonds are like $35,000, which makes it really hard for a person to actually get out of detention. But they're eligible to ask for release. And so what this decision is basically, it's going to eliminate the right to bond for many of these asylum seekers. Again, mass detention. And so if you look at our judiciary, the makeup, particularly in this space, is going to mean extremely harsher conditions and negative laws. Yes.
Yeah, I guess now mine is kind of a follow-up question to that. So you already talked about, we're seeing the populations coming to the southern border are much more made up of families and kids looking for asylum than, say, 5 years, 10 years ago when they were, not necessarily approaching border protection, virtual CBP, looking for those same international protections, and we're seeing the spaces that already exist for those protection seekers closing by the minute, the Matter AB decision, I think. And I was just wondering, so you've talked a little bit about how some of those opportunities for people like you to do something have become more challenging. So are you seeing that happening, those credible fear interviews being harder and harder for folks to get? Are you seeing, and then, while it's still technically illegal now for those families to be detained indefinitely, do the new regulations that are imposed approaching, are you seeing preparations for that, for detaining?
Yes. So credible fear interview, again, just it's an opportunity to speak to an asylum officer about the reason why you applied. Typically, there's a right to a consultant at that point. The regulations call it a consultant. It could be a lawyer, but for most part, folks don't have access to a lawyer at that stage in the process. And so they just talk to an asylum officer about why they fled. And as I tried to elaborate in the talk, many have fled gang violence, and the Attorney General has rendered a decision that has sort of eliminated asylum, the eligibility for asylum based on a claim of gang violence. And so we are seeing asylum officers at that first initial level, which is not the full asylum case, but at the first initial level, denying those cases based on this decision. And what's happening what was the second part of the question? Sorry.
Just that now with the new regulations.
Oh, yes. And so she's talking about, briefly mentioned the Flores settlement agreement. Kids can only be detained for 20 days before they're released. They have all these protections. The government has issued a new proposed regulation, which is required under the Administrative Procedure Act. So the agency issues the regulation, and then there's a notice and comment period. And so that's where we're at right now, is the notice and comment period. I haven't actually read the regulation, but I know that our partners who deal with a lot of the children are really gearing. I was just at Kine's office, Kids in Need of Defense. They are like right here. If anybody wants to help in this space, they work with the children. They're a fantastic organization. So they are definitely gearing. The child advocates are gearing up for what's going to be a really tough few years. Litigation, yeah, absolutely.
I'd say more to the point, if anyone wants light reading, the regulations themselves are like 9-point font and like 3 columns per page times 234 pages. So like the point of people getting lost in the system, right, when it becomes like line item 4 on page 155, you understand how it's so easy to like lose your, for folks to like take the human element out of it.
Yeah.
If they're glazed over trying to read these regulations.
Is there a sense on the ground that, you know, the inhumanity of separating families is going to be the degree of emotional trauma for these children, adolescents, going to grow up with these, you know, you think about a disgruntled postal worker, you know, who gets fired, wreaking havoc on a small scale, but this is mass emotional trauma.
Yeah.
Is there a sense that it's going to come back on the ground, or people on the ground, you know, your advocates, your colleagues, that this is going to come back to bite us in 20, 30 years when these kids grow up?
Yep. Yeah, I think the child's advocate, yes. And so at least for our cases, so we interviewed 382 families, which we try and help provide support to, not only for their immigration case, but try and connect them with social services providers. So we do have an effort to try and volunteer psychologists in areas where we have clusters of clients so they can speak with the children and with the parents. But yeah, it's going, yes. I mean, I also tried to touch on that at the beginning. You know, I think all refugees in our country have suffered severely, and we don't have the mechanisms to provide the emotional support for it to make a difference. It's tough. I read these reports, you know, for it sounds like you may be working in this space, but for all the children who are in government custody, you know, they do meet with social workers while they're in custody. They do meet with therapists. They do like art exercises and stuff like that. But the whole situation they're in is wrapped in trauma. I mean, they're in prison, so it's sort of hard to understand what the effectiveness of that is at all, if any.
One thing that I've always found frustrating in the public discourse is there's such a disconnect sometimes between the research that, you know, many wonderful think tanks around the country have put forward on the value that immigrants bring to this country economically, you know, over the course of their integration into the community and how they're able to give back financially and economically to their new communities. And then there's this sort of the negative connotations with, you know, for new coming immigrants, and, you know, sort of bridging that divide between how immigrants are presented in the public discourse when we're talking about, you know, new policies and how to tackle these challenges. You know, it'd be interesting to hear from you how, you know, your colleagues, we hear of the great work that your you know, Texas Civil Rights Project is doing, and other on the ground organizations, and we hear at the same time as well, you know, how the government is scaling up their efforts at the border. And so would you be able to share a little bit more about the playing field, and, you know, how is there any scaling up among the players that are sort of pushing forward advocacy to meet the challenges presented by sort of these gaps in perception on, you know, what immigrants bring to this country?
Mm-hmm. Good question. Maybe it just sort of structurally, I think it's definitely is. I feel like it's a David versus Goliath situation. We're a small organization. We have 25 staffers, and that is small. I think we're 16 lawyers, but when you think of where are you going to have the most impact, you know, you have to be really smart and strategic, and you have to be listening to the community, really being integrated into a community where it's not about immigrants or whatever, you're just in the community. So the discourse happening up here is actually not happening down here, right? And so that's the thing about community lawyering, which is so powerful, because you're just integrated into a community and responding to calls when the shit goes down. And it happens a lot. And we do need to, you know, expand our capacity, and our allies need to as well. And then just linking arms to try and work together as much as we can, and try and lean on to, institutions with money, law firms. We work with a lot of pro bono law firms that have a lot of money, a lot of resources. So we have 12 law firms that have taken on about 100 of immigration cases for our clients. So I help advise them, mentor them. So we are able to sort of expand our efforts by just being smart with our partnerships. But the public discourse, I agree, that's a tough one.
Yeah.
I'll leave that to y'all in Washington.
One more here. Thank you. So I was listening to a news story recently about the parents that they've been able to locate of the kids who are still here. And it said something like 80% of the parents would rather that the kids stay here because the conditions in their home countries are so bad.
Yeah.
Have you experienced that a lot?
Yeah.
Even separate from them?
Yeah. So those parents who were deported without their children, we have 12 or 13. 2 of them chose reunification. No, 3 of them chose reunification. 2 of them actually have been reunified. 1 still has not. The rest of them elected to have their children remain in the U.S. And so if you think about the journey that they took, why they left, I mean, in some ways it makes sense. Like, they went through all of that just to have their child put right back in the same situation. And so it's a tough choice. In most situations, the child has been released from government custody when the parent makes that decision.
They have like family here and stuff.
It could be a family member. It could be just a sponsor, somebody they know. So in most situations, that is the case. What's really challenging, and what the story may not have covered, is those parents who are still in detention and languishing now, whose children are still in government custody, but the father or mother is just going crazy. Yeah, I have to get out of here. Like, it's awful conditions. And so the parent, and we talk them through their options. They can be deported, relinquish their rights to the child, but if nobody raises their hand for the kid is going to be orphaned. That's a depressing note. Can we to end on?
Yeah, I have a final. I'll try.
Okay.
Well, thank you everyone for really wonderful questions and for joining us today. If you're not a lawyer, if you don't speak Spanish, but you're upset about this and you want to help within the civic engagement space, how would you suggest people focus their efforts?
Right. I mean, in this particular space, I just mentioned KIND's offices. It's right here. They're children's advocates, so they have both lawyers and non-lawyer volunteer opportunities. So that's one organization I can think of. There are so many fantastic immigrant rights organizations. Eric, you remember, like, people are at the border, but then they leave to other places. So I don't remember the names of the DC-based organizations, but there's lots of them here that are fantastic.
Sure. Wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thank you,
for
everyone.
Sharing your
Thank you for
experience with us,
coming.
and thank you everyone for
Thank you.
coming.